All right, so you want to understand how capitalism has driven expansion through history.
Yeah, and you've given us a ton of sources to work with. It's pretty amazing. We've got historical accounts,
Right. Yeah.
economic theories, modern case studies even.
It's going to be really interesting to see what we find as we compare and contrast things like Columbus's voyages
Right.
to, today's multinational corporations and see how these are linked by the idea of capitalist expansion.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how these sources all point to the same underlying need within capitalism,
Uh-huh.
this need for constant growth. It's almost like,
What, like a shark needing to keep swimming?
exactly,
Yeah.
always moving, always expanding to survive.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
But why is that? Why is this growth so important for capitalism? Not every economic system has that same drive, right?
Right. It's really fundamental to how the whole thing works. To make a profit, the system needs new markets, new customers,
Uh,
new resources. It has to keep expanding outwards.
so if it doesn't expand.
If it doesn't expand, the whole thing starts to falter.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this need for growth kind of sets the stage for all the different tactics and strategies that we're going to explore.
Exactly.
So let's dive in. We're starting with Columbus's voyages, which our sources present as uh, much more than just discovering America.
Yeah, it's way more than just discovering a new landmass.
Right.
Columbus really kicks off what we can call phase one,
Okay.
which is mercantilism and colonial extraction. This period, roughly from 1492 to 1700, is all about European powers racing to conquer new territories and grab resources.
And they weren't exactly peaceful about it,
Yeah.
right? Our sources mentioned this document called the Spanish Requerimiento. What was that all about?
The Requerimiento. This was a document often read to the indigenous populations in Spanish, which, of course, most of them didn't understand,
Okay.
declaring Spanish sovereignty over the land and demanding submission to the crown and the Christian faith.
Oh, wow.
And if the native people resisted, well, that was seen as justification for war and enslavement.
It's incredible how they could use religion and legal jargon to justify just taking what wasn't theirs.
Yeah, it shows how even in this early phase, expansion was a combination of raw force
Yeah.
and ideology. The Requerimiento wasn't just a formality, it provided a legal basis for dispossession.
And of course, our sources detail some truly horrific examples of the violence that went along with this expansion, like the 1495 Vega Real massacre in Hispaniola.
Yeah, that was orchestrated by Columbus himself. Thousands of Taino people were killed, and it secured Spanish control over resources like gold mines.
It really shows how profit often came at a terrible human cost. It's a pattern that, sadly, keeps repeating itself. But as we move into the 18th century, our sources show a shift happening.
Right, around 1700 to 1900, we enter phase two,
Okay.
which is the rise of Enlightenment ideology and industrial capitalism. This is the era of thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith who really shaped economic thought.
Yeah, their ideas about free trade and the invisible hand of the market, those were really revolutionary at the time. But our sources suggest we need to look at them a little more critically.
Exactly. While they promoted free trade, their theories often ignored or downplayed the exploitation that was happening in the colonies. Industrialization was creating a huge demand for raw materials and new markets.
And that demand.
That demand was being met through the labor of enslaved Africans, fueling even more expansion.
So it's like, even though there was this talk about free trade and progress, the reality on the ground was still very much about exploitation and control.
Unfortunately, yes. A perfect example of this is the British East India Company. It wasn't just a company, it was like a state within a state.
Right.
They had their own armies, and their role in the 1857 Indian Rebellion,
Also known as.
also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, shows just how much force they were willing to use to control trade.
It's mind-blowing how much power these companies have. It almost seems like a preview of the multinational corporations we see today.
You could say that.
So moving into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, our sources point to a new phase emerging.
Yes, this is phase three,
Okay.
spanning roughly from 1890 to 1945. It's the age of imperialism, and we see the rise of what are called parastatal organizations.
Parastatal organizations.
Yeah.
What exactly are those?
Think of them as groups that work closely with the state, but they're not officially part of the government. They operate in this sort of gray area, often with a lot of power and influence.
Okay.
A good example is the Jewish National Fund's activities in Palestine. They were buying up land, often displacing Arab tenants to
Wait.
make way for Jewish settlements.
So They were acting as agents of expansion, but with some distance from the official state apparatus.
Exactly. This phase also sees the rise of corporate colonialism, with companies like the United Fruit Company wielding huge power in Latin America.
Why?
They weren't just businesses, they were political forces using their influence to shape governments, even orchestrating coups to protect their interests.
Yeah.
The overthrow of the Guatemalan government in 1954, backed by the United Fruit Company.
Wow.
That's a prime example.
It's incredible how these companies could act with such impunity. It's like they were shadow governments.
It really blurs the lines between corporate power and state power, and that trend only continues as we move into the next phase.
Which brings us to the era we're in now, Phase 4,
Right.
neoliberalism and financialized domination, starting around 1945 and continuing to the present day. How has capitalist expansion adapted in this context?
Well, this phase is marked by the rise of neoliberal policies. Free trade agreements, deregulation, privatization, and the growing influence of global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. These institutions wield immense power, often through something called structural adjustment programs, or SAPs.
Okay, can you explain those a bit? They sound kind of ominous.
Think of it this way. A country struggling economically goes to the IMF or World Bank for a loan, but the loan comes with conditions attached.
Oh, interesting.
These conditions, the SAPs, often require the country to implement austerity measures, cut social programs, and open up their markets to foreign competition.
And while that might sound like economic reform on the surface, I'm guessing from our sources that it often has negative consequences.
Yeah, SAPs are very controversial because critics argue that they prioritize debt repayment over the well-being of the people.
Okay.
They can lead to increased poverty, job losses, and a weakening of public services, as countries are pressured to put the demands of global finance ahead of their own citizens' needs.
It's amazing and a little unnerving to see how these methods have evolved, from brute force to these financial mechanisms. But it seems like the underlying goal is still the same: secure resources and expand markets.
You've hit the nail on the head, and as we continue this deep dive, it will be fascinating to see how these tactics continue to play out in the 21st century.
Definitely. So we've got these 4 phases of expansion, but before we go deeper into how these play out in specific cases, it'd be great to get your take on the big picture. What are some key similarities and differences you've noticed across these phases?
Well, one thing that stands out is how across all 4 phases, there's this exploitation of power imbalances to fuel expansion. Whether it's military force, economic policies, or control over narratives, it's all about leveraging power to extract resources and generate profit.
Yeah, it seems like the specific tools might change,
Yeah.
but that core principle of exploiting vulnerabilities remains constant. What about differences? How have the tactics evolved?
I'd say one major shift has been the move away from direct colonial control towards more subtle forms of economic and political influence. We see this with the rise of multinational corporations,
Right.
the power of global institutions like the IMF and these complex global supply chains. It's a form of globalization where power transcends national boundaries, which makes it much harder to pinpoint responsibility and hold anyone accountable.
It's like colonialism has gone global.
In a way, yes.
It's far more complex and harder to grasp than those straightforward conquests of earlier eras.
Absolutely. And that complexity makes it all the more important to understand the historical patterns and how they're still shaping the world today.
This has definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm really looking forward to diving deeper. But for now, we'll leave our listeners with that.
Yeah, it's worth reflecting on these historical patterns and how they might be playing out in our own lives, even in ways we might not immediately see.
Thanks for joining us for part 1 of this deep dive. We'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the mechanisms and consequences of capitalist expansion.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of capitalist expansion. We spent part 1 laying out the 4 phases of this expansion, really highlighting that inherent need for growth and how that shaped global events for centuries.
Yeah, and as we were getting ready for this, it really struck me how interconnected all the mechanisms of expansion actually are.
It's not just about military force or just economic policy. It's about this whole combination of different tools working together, to create and maintain power.
Absolutely. It's like having a whole toolkit with, different tools for different situations.
Mhm.
And one tool that we see used consistently, unfortunately, is military and paramilitary force.
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling how often violence comes up in our sources,
Yeah.
from Columbus's conquistadors
All right.
all the way to, modern private military companies. It seems like force has always been a go-to option.
It's true, unfortunately. Military force is often used to secure territory, suppress any resistance, and protect those economic interests.
Hmm.
Like we talked about in part one, the Vega Real massacre.
Yeah.
It wasn't just some random act of brutality. It was a calculated strategy to eliminate opposition and gain control over those valuable gold mines.
It's just a stark reminder of the human cost of expansion.
Right.
And it's not always official armies either. Our sources talk about paramilitary groups like the Irgun in Haganah in Palestine.
Acting as kind of agents of expansion, often with, at least tacit support from governments.
Right, they operate in the shadows, using violence and intimidation to pave the way for land seizures, resource extraction, all that. The Deir Yassin massacre in 1948, where hundreds of Palestinian villagers were killed by Zionist paramilitary forces, is a tragic example.
It's really disturbing how these actions were, and sometimes still are, justified in the name of progress or national interest. But you mentioned earlier that violence alone isn't enough, right? It needs to be legitimized somehow.
Exactly. You need a system of rules, laws, even narratives that make exploitation seem acceptable or even natural. It's about shaping perceptions, creating a sense of, inevitability, often hiding the true costs.
So it's not just about brute force.
Yeah.
It's about controlling the narrative.
Yeah.
Making people believe that this system is beneficial.
Right.
Or even, divinely ordained, no matter who gets hurt.
That's exactly right. And we see this from the very beginning. The Spanish recorrimiento, that's a perfect example of legal manipulation, using religious and legal language to justify taking land from the people who are already there.
It's amazing how they managed to twist things like logic and morality to serve their own interests.
It is.
And as we move into the era of industrial capitalism, we see how the ideas of thinkers like Adam Smith, while they were groundbreaking in many ways, they also helped to shape this narrative around free markets and individual self-interest that could be used to justify further expansion.
Right. The invisible hand theory, while it does promote efficiency in some ways, it often overlooks the social and environmental costs that come with, unfettered capitalism. So it ends up being used to justify things like colonial expansion, even though that wasn't Smith's intention.
It's a reminder that even good ideas can be twisted and used in harmful ways. But even with force and ideology, you still need something else to really drive expansion on a global scale, right? And that's where the power of financial instruments comes in.
Exactly. Financial instruments and trade mechanisms, that's where things get really complex, especially with the rise of global finance, institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and all these complicated trade agreements. These institutions wield so much power, shaping national economies and often dictating terms that benefit corporations and wealthy nations.
And speaking of the IMF and World Bank, our sources spend a lot of time talking about structural adjustment programs.
Right, SAPs.
Can you break those down for us a little?
Think of it like this. A country is struggling with its budget, right? They need a loan, so they turn to the IMF or World Bank for help. But these loans come with strings attached, these conditions, which are the SAPs. And often these conditions require countries to implement austerity measures, cut back on social programs,
Oh, wow.
and open up their markets to foreign competition.
It sounds like, it could lead to a lot of economic hardship, especially for those who are already struggling.
That's exactly the criticism. While SAPs are often presented as a path to stability, critics argue that they actually prioritize debt repayment and foreign investors over the well-being of the people in that country. It can result in job losses, cuts to essential services, increased poverty, all as resources are diverted to satisfy those creditors.
It's a more subtle form of control, but the consequences can be just as devastating, really. So we've got force, we've got legal frameworks, we've got these financial mechanisms all working together. But there's another piece to this puzzle, right? Something maybe a little less tangible. Cultural hegemony.
Ah, yes, cultural hegemony. This is the realm of ideas, beliefs, values, those subtle ways in which capitalism shapes how we see the world and even ourselves. It's about normalizing its values, making the system seem inevitable, even beneficial, even when it's not.
Can you give us an example of how that plays out in, everyday life?
Sure. Think about how we're constantly bombarded with messages that buying more stuff will make us happier. Or how competition and individual success are, prized above cooperation or community well-being. These are all examples of how cultural norms can be shaped to reinforce those capitalist values.
So it's not just about controlling resources and economies. It's about shaping our desires, what we want, even our sense of who we are.
Right. It's much more insidious because it works on this deeper, often unconscious level.
And this cultural dominance it often goes hand in hand with other forms of oppression too, right? Like racism and patriarchy.
Absolutely. Those systems are deeply intertwined with capitalism. Racism, for example, has been used to justify exploitation and create divisions among the working class. Think about colonialism, how racist ideologies were used to dehumanize indigenous populations, justify taking their land and enslaving them. And those beliefs, sadly, still have a lasting impact on inequalities today.
It's a good reminder that any fight for a more just and sustainable world has to include addressing these different interlocking systems of oppression. But before we get into potential alternatives, we need to look at the consequences of this expansion.
Right, because understanding those consequences, both past and present, is key to understanding the full scope of the issue and finding solutions.
Welcome back to the deep dive. In parts 1 and 2, we really got into the history of capitalist expansion.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
We talked about, that inherent need for growth within the system and all the different tools used to make that happen, from military force to legal manipulation, financial mechanisms, all of it.
Right, and how those tools have evolved over time.
But now we need to talk about the consequences.
Yeah, this is where we really see the human and ecological costs of that expansion, All that pursuit of profit and growth, it often comes at the expense of people and the planet.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most obvious and devastating consequences is, demographic change, often brought about by force or coercion. Our sources really highlight how indigenous populations have been decimated and displaced throughout history.
It's a tragic pattern, and it's happened everywhere. From the early colonial conquests to modern-day land grabs, it's this constant story of indigenous peoples being pushed off their land, their cultures disrupted.
And it's not just, physical displacement either. It's often tied to other forms of oppression and exploitation.
Right, you can't separate them.
Our sources make it clear that capitalism, by its very nature, relies on creating these hierarchies. Whether it's based on race, class, gender, it's about dividing people and creating these power imbalances.
You see that throughout history. Think about the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forced into slavery,
Yeah.
their labor fueling the growth of European economies, or the exploitation of factory workers during the Industrial Revolution, people working in dangerous conditions for almost nothing.
It's easy to think of those examples as, things of the past. But our sources make it pretty clear that these systems of oppression are still at play today.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, think about the global supply chains that produce, our clothes, our electronics. So much of it relies on exploiting workers in developing countries.
Right. Low wages, unsafe conditions, very few rights. It all comes down to profit, even if it means sacrificing basic human dignity.
And we can't forget about the environmental consequences either.
Of course not.
This constant push for growth has really pushed the planet to its limits.
Yeah, and treating the planet as, just an endless source of resources, that's just not sustainable. Deforestation, pollution, climate change, it's all connected.
It feels like we're on this, treadmill running faster and faster, but not really getting anywhere. So what can we do? Is there a way out of this?
Our sources do offer some alternatives, but they all seem to require some pretty big changes. There are no easy answers, that's for sure. But I think acknowledging the problem is the first step. We need to be honest about how the system works, and we need to be willing to question our assumptions.
Our sources mention this concept of degrowth, which seemed to challenge the idea that we need constant economic growth.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical idea. Degrowth is basically saying that endless economic growth isn't necessary, and it might not even be desirable, especially considering, the limits of our planet.
So it's about, scaling back production and consumption.
Right. It's shifting our focus away from just constantly accumulating more stuff and looking at, what truly creates well-being, strong communities, healthy relationships, living in harmony with nature.
This is a big shift in thinking, for sure. Is that even realistic?
It won't be easy, that's for sure. There are powerful forces that benefit from keeping things the way they are, and the problems we face are huge.
Yeah.
But I do think it's necessary. Climate change, inequality, these are urgent problems. We need bold solutions. And even if degrowth seems radical, it offers a way to rethink our relationship with the economy and with the planet.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this.
Yeah.
But it is helpful to remember that there are people out there working on solutions.
Exactly. There are movements for change happening all over.
So what can our listeners do? What are some concrete things they can do to be part of this change?
Well, education is always a good place to start. Read those sources we mentioned. Do your own research about things like degrowth, talk to people about these ideas,
Right, get the conversation going.
and support businesses that are aligned with your values, choose products that are ethically and sustainably produced. And, be an advocate, get involved in your community, hold your elected officials accountable.
And most importantly, don't give up hope.
Exactly.
That's a marathon, not a sprint.
That's right.
Expert speaker, thank you so much for guiding us through this. It's been a really challenging, but also hopeful deep dive.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand these systems, the better we can challenge them and create a more just future for everyone.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope this deep dive has inspired you to learn more and to get involved. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.